Preventing workplace violence. Workplace violence in the United States is a serious problem. On average, about 3 to 4 workers are murdered each day in the U.S., and 15% of these are supervisors or managers. In addition, an estimated 1 million workers are assaulted annually in U.S. workplaces. Sensational acts of violence by coworkers that you hear about in the media are actually only a small part of the total number of violent acts committed in the workplace each day. Violence is the leading cause of death for women in the workplace and the second leading cause of death for men, according to the United States Occupational Health and Safety Administration. Each year, 2 million American workers are victims of violence at work, ranging from intimidating threats to homicide. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, about 11% of the workplace homicides are committed by a coworker, former coworker, or a customer. About 3/4 of all workplace violence was committed by unarmed offenders, but more than 80% of the workplace homicides were committed with firearms. What is workplace violence? Workplace violence is an incident of violent action, violent behavior, or threat of violent behavior in the employment setting or related to employment. These acts can be classified as severe forms of harassment, verbal abuse, battery, which is the use of force against another person, assault, threatening behavior, fighting, physical assaults, and of course, homicide. By the way, do you know that offensive touching another person can be considered battery, and that such an act does not have to be proven as intentional to be considered battery? This eliminates the excuse some batterers have used that an act of offensive touching was simply an accident. Violence at work may also be psychological. Use of symbols or gestures that communicate a violent intent or can be perceived by another person to reasonably be communicating violent intent are a psychological form of violence. Pointing your finger to imitate the shooting of a gun is a good example. Be sure to know the definition of workplace violence used in your work organization's workplace violence policy if it has one. Workplace violence can occur inside or outside of the workplace. It can include coworkers, customers, or people you know or don't know outside of work. A common type of workplace violence, especially against women, is a person under a restraining order who visits the workplace to intimidate or harass the victim. No one can predict when a violent act will occur, but steps can be taken to increase personal safety and reduce risk to the organization. Everyone has a role, not just managers or corporate leadership. That means it is important for you to understand signs and symptoms of potential workplace violence, know what to do if it occurs, and what you can do to stop or prevent it. Some workers are at increased risk of workplace violence because of the duties or tasks that they perform. Of course, no one is immune. For example, workers who exchange money with the public, deliver passengers, goods, or services, work with patients or emotionally ill persons, and work alone or in small groups during late-night shifts or early morning hours in high-crime areas are at increased risk. Research shows that taxi drivers consistently experience the highest risk of being killed in workplace-related violence. Research and statistics vary among sources, but other high-risk work settings are liquor stores, gas stations, detective protective services, courts, police and correctional system occupations, grocery stores, jewelry stores, hotels, motels, and eating-drinking places. Risk exists in any occupation, so don't think that if your job does not include any of the positions previously mentioned, that violence in the workplace can't happen to you. It's important to understand the warning signs and common sense principles associated with prevention to protect yourself and others. There is no typical profile of a person likely to become violent, but there are signs and symptoms that, when considered in total, increase the likelihood that an employee may act violently. The following are just a few of these behavioral signs and symptoms. Employees may demonstrate a pattern of being intolerant of criticism and suspicious of coworkers. Delusions, strong, unshakable false beliefs about others in the workplace, especially the supervisor, may be exhibited. The employee may be quick to anger or demonstrate an uncontrollable temper. Being prone to arguing, exhibiting intimidating behavior, or carrying a grudge has also been commonly reported among employees who become violent at work. Other signs and symptoms of an employee potentially likely to become violent include being isolated and showing little involvement with coworkers, repeating threats or a history of making threats against the organization or individual employees, having a fascination with weapons and literature related to firearms, sympathizing with perpetrators of workplace violence in media stories, for example, saying, "I can see why he did it. You have to see things from his perspective," showing desperation over a disciplinary action, especially termination. Employees who become violent may have experienced recent and acute personal problems, financial, relationship, legal, etc., rejection or suddenly failed romantic relationships, a history of being ridiculed or degraded by coworkers, victims of bullying perpetrated by a coworker or a supervisor, a known history of psychological problems, impulsive behavior, or a history of antisocial or violent acts toward others. Here are some important do's and don'ts. Do take threats of workplace violence seriously. A violent or homicidal act in the workplace is not preceded by drama, music, and a character build-up like on TV. Violence is usually sudden and unexpected, an unexplainable event accompanied by disbelief by victims and witnesses. Never say, "It can't happen here." Follow safety and prevention guidelines offered by your organization. If you are a supervisor, orient your employees to the basics of workplace violence prevention. Don't dismiss threats of violence as venting or blowing off steam. Most incidents of workplace homicide followed threats that were not taken seriously. Don't join in the group or give in to group pressure to behave inappropriately toward coworkers. Instead, choose to be the one who says no to disrespect, ethnic slurs, and degrading behavior toward others. Do avoid horseplay at work. Horseplay can be violent or quickly lead to violent behavior. This is why it is prohibited in many workplaces and is against the law in federal workplaces. Do report offensive or intimidating behavior in the workplace toward others. Do learn how to recognize, avoid, or safely diffuse potentially violent situations by attending personal safety training programs available through work or in your community. Do alert your supervisor to any concerns that you have about safety or security. Don't keep your fear to yourself when you think an employee or coworker could become violent. Talk to a supervisor or a professional counselor to discuss your concerns. After a violent incident, many employees have stated they weren't surprised that employee became violent. Do report violent incidents immediately and in writing. If you're unsure what to do, still share your thoughts or feelings with a supervisor or a helping professional who can help you further examine your concerns.